Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be. I know we have international attendees too. So hello and welcome to day 2 of the Michigan OER Virtual Summit. I hope you enjoyed yesterday's first day. I've heard a lot of positive comments, both on Twitter, and some of you emailed me. So thank you. Thank you for your support, and thank you for attending this summit so far. So my name is Regina Gong. I am the OER and Student Success Librarian at Michigan State University. And I'm getting distracted with all the things that are in the chat. Well, anyway, I'd like to start by thanking all of the organizations and people who made this virtual conference possible. As you know, putting up a virtual conference really takes a lot of hard work. And so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Michigan Higher Education Compact, which is our partner for conference management and event logistics. I'd like to pay shout out and thanks to Katie Schock for doing all the work behind the scenes, and you must have received a ton of emails from her. So thank you, Katie, and also to Annika Maney and Jenny Parks of MEC. And I'd also like to thank MSU Libraries for sponsoring our keynote speakers. So if you were here yesterday, our keynote speaker was Angela DeBarger, and we have another keynote speaker today, Lisa Petrylis. And also, I would like to thank the My OER Network Steering Committee and the My OER Network Program Planning Committee for planning a spectacular virtual conference this year. As you know, this is the 4th time that we are doing the Michigan OER Summit, but this is the first time that we are doing it on a virtual format. So thank you to you, and most of all, you who are here attending the conference. We have almost over 600 registrants this year, and for that we thank you, and I hope you have a nice conference experience today. So without further ado, I will introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Lisa Petrylis. She's the CEO of ISME. Yes, I pronounce it well. And ISME stands for Institute for the Study of Knowledge Management in Education. Yay, I memorized it, Lisa. So 3 weeks ago, I had a chance to visit Lisa at the office of ISME in Half Moon Bay, right? And it's really, really so cool. I wish I can show you. I took a video of it. It's like the office that I want to work in, because it's just like so cool, the layout and just the view of the ocean. And so, yeah, and I remember meeting Lisa in one of the Open Ed conferences, and she attended our presentation on women of color, right? Women of color, OER leaders. And I was just so touched by the way she, by her support of us and our presentation. And I really value you as a colleague, Lisa, and thank you for agreeing to be our keynote speaker for this conference. And her talk is provocative, so I'm really, really excited, and I'm sure you are as well. So, Lisa.
Okay. Good day, good morning, good day, good evening. It's great to see some of you from around the globe. I'm Lisa Petrylis and Regina and the Michigan OER team. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk today. I think I was looking forward to this last year, as I recall. Here we are a year later, still virtual, but still together, most importantly. And why I especially thank you is because I have been working in this field for just nearly 2 decades, and to have the opportunity to really reflect and think about the choices we've made and the pathways we've taken. It was just really a great opportunity to do so. And I want to just talk a little bit about the title of the talk, What We Got Right and Wrong, a 20-year retrospective. I was sort of teasing Regina because of a tweet she sent out earlier that said what we did right and did wrong. And this really isn't about what we did right and wrong. It's about, in retrospect, looking back, what did we get right? And where did we hit the mark and where didn't we? And what does that really mean for the future? So, as this field of open education comes of age, it really felt like the time to take an honest assessment of the decisions we've made. And most importantly, do we understand sort of the choice points that are in front of us now? And do we make those choices based on who we want to be? That we could say that as individuals or as a field, as a profession. So I'd like to shed some light on a few of these choices that we've made over the past 20 years. Based on my perspective, and I'd like to think I can be objective in some way, but in fact, my experiences and my perceptions are based on my own experience as an educator, as a woman, as a white woman working in the field of education and in the field of OER. So it will necessarily be subjective based on my own lived experience. And there's a bit of a background, and to give you a sense of my work. The organization that I founded, the Institute for the Study of Knowledge Management and Education, otherwise known as ISKME, we were really founded on concepts of open data, open knowledge sharing, continuous learning, all of this in service to access and equity in education. We were involved very early on, the early 2000s, attending one of Hewlett's first OER meetings. In 2004, I think it was, we received a grant to actually conduct a piece of research from them. And the grant was to look at 60 or so organizations that they had helped fund who were creating OER. And our job was to simply go out and see what were all the topics, what were the subjects, had they licensed the content in some way, what license did they use, what metadata did they gather, all of these kinds of things. So we put it in this big Excel spreadsheet. It had over 2,000 rows in it. And we brought it to then Mike Smith, who was leading the education group at Hewlett at the time. We said, here you go. And he said, I can't read that. Put it in some kind of online database or something that I can see. So before we knew it, in July 2005, we were searching for domain names. And the first digital library of OER Commons is what we settled on. It was launched in 2007. Now, as early as 2008, we had received funding, for example, from the Ford Foundation to create OER with art teachers and teaching artists. They were really looking at this issue of arts and social justice to address concerns of art programs that had been eliminated in K-12 schools. So very early on, there were programs that were being funded that were looking at different topic areas, even though OER was, extraordinarily nascent at that time. Today, you might know, we continue still to host and produce the OER Commons Library, along with several dozen libraries and communities of practice around OER. And we support those with communities of practice and professional development and research. And in fact, speaking of research, we conducted a study early on, I think it was around 2010. It was on collaborative authoring of OER with Connections at the time. Now they're called OpenStax at Rice University. And we analyzed over 13,000 records of author and co-author activity. One particular interesting finding was that those author groups that had 2 or more co-authors were much more likely to keep their content updated and to continuously improve on it. So we're sort of getting that sense early on that collaboration around content was a good thing. So there are so many things about the past 20 years in our experience. I can't possibly cover them all and name everyone, but there were so many mavericks, champions, risk takers, enthusiasts. One very pivotal year for me was fortunate enough to be invited to Cape Town, South Africa, where we created the Cape Town Declaration. And that was the first time we were really with like-minded partners from around the world. And we really had these conversations about education and access and equity and where it could go and why it mattered. So as I promised, I want to focus on choice points that we made over time. So, you know, a choice point is simply a moment in time when we can sort of choose to act in one way or another way. And often it's, you know, you're trying to be consistent with your values or other kinds of goals and objectives that you have. So it's really only in retrospect that we can say, well, where did we get it right? Where did we miss the mark? Maybe at that time it made sense to focus on one particular thing, but ultimately in hindsight, things look differently. Sometimes, well, as we move forward in our classrooms and in our institutions and in the policy arena, you know, I kind of wanted just to ask us, how do we really honor and make a good on that potential of open education? And so today I really wanted to just reflect on what I'm going to say are some historical antecedents of our choice points in the past, with the goal to really begin to understand why we made the decisions we did and how to move forward, most importantly, with a really solid commitment to a future in which equitable and inclusive learning environments contribute to the creation of a more just and humane society. So to me, that's our task. That's what I strive for today and every day that I choose to be involved in this work. By the way, a little bit of my inspiration for this talk today, if any of you follow Heather Cox Richardson, she's an American historian and professor at Boston College, and she writes a nightly newsletter about current events in the context of American history. And I highly recommend it. It's called Letters from an American. But it gave me some inspiration to really think about how we talk about history and how it really impacts what we do today. So 2001, so it's been about 2 decades. Let me just get to the slides. Here we go. So 2001. 2001, the iPod was introduced. The first Harry Potter movie came out. But it's also the founding of some pretty significant things that were impacting us in OER. Wikipedia was founded, MIT OpenCourseWare, the Wayback Machine at the Internet Archive, Creative Commons, and ISKME, although we weren't actually incorporated until 2002, but I decided to kind of sneak us in there anyway. So let me just move right into sort of the first choice point as I see it. So while OER as a field is really said to start around the early 2000s, really if you look back like in the early 70s, the idea that access to knowledge was power, that had really taken hold, at least from the perspective of educators and education. If some of you might remember or have read about Abby Hoffman's Steal This Book, which was centered on the counterculture of the 70s, it's one of sort of the earliest examples of saying, you know, how important it is to ultimately transfer knowledge to anybody who wants it. So while the advent of open source software and freeware, how could we apply those same principles to education? A lot of us had been thinking about what that means. And, you know, what could it mean to open source education, right? What if we could apply the same principles to education? What could it mean to enable teachers and learners to contribute back to the process of education? this seems kind of common now, right? 20 years later, but these are some of the things we were thinking about then. Could we build a community of educators who wanted to contribute in these kinds of ways, like software developers were contributing to open source software, right? Just imagine if we could have this brain trust that decades of teaching experience, every teacher who's been working for decades and retires, imagine what they take with them, right? What if we could harness it, pass it along, build on it? What would be the collective intelligence of educators in terms of teaching, whether it's math or science or language, literature, anthropology? So these were really the questions we were asking, and particularly as educators, this question of, is open source, can we use this as a mechanism for the redistribution of power? And so how can we get this means of production into the hands of educators and students? Access, equity, distributing power, barn raising, there are a lot of metaphors that were used at the time. Again, think about 2001, 2002, really building on the whole remix culture. How do we move education to something that is more than just a static one-way flow of information? Some good examples, I think, that really show this point. If you might know of Siavula, back then, Mark Horner and a group of fellow science PhDs, they were going to science fairs all over South Africa, and kids had come up to them and they were seeing these demonstrations of waveforms and things like that. And they came up to them and they said, "Oh, could you write this down for us here, in this notebook?" And they said, "Sure, we'll write it down." And they'd write it down and they'd ask them for all this detail. And they'd say, "Well, don't you have this in your books?" And they realized that these kids actually didn't have any high school science books at all. So this really became sort of this movement about free high school science textbooks, which you can read about, and I can certainly give you links later to see about the Free High School Science Textbooks Project and then the work of Siavula, 15 plus years later. So this concept, can we open source education? Right on the mark, right? If anything, maybe we were a little bit naive about how the latest technology was going to support it and solve it. We assumed, or we had hoped, that educators would be more comfortable with the technology than they were. Connections, which is now OpenStax, it was a fine authoring platform. It was one of the first. And if you were a brilliant digital signal processing engineer like its founders were, you could use it very easily. It was really kind of groundbreaking, but not necessarily something that educators could use and access so easily. So I would say this was a little bit is kind of it's a technology phase of OER. It wasn't yet anything that was really steeped in classroom teaching practice or pedagogy. So I'm going to go to the second choice point, which is about open licensing. Oh, and by the way, all these slides will be available for you after this as well. So open licensing, the question that we were really asking then is, what kind of structures or rules could be used to facilitate collaboration and sharing? And the question here was saying, well, open source software already had a handful of licenses and growing. There were probably at least a dozen or so or more. And then we have Creative Commons, which comes out at this time. These licenses had recently been rolled out, and they were definitely the most exciting thing around. At ISKME, we spent the first few years, starting around 2007, when OER Commons was launched, just going around the country and explaining to teachers about OER and the legal aspects of licensing. And of course, it was met with a lot of kind of glazed over looks, like, just let me teach. I don't care about legal, and I just take what I want anyway. I can't, this is too much for me to really comprehend it and use. In fact, I remember we did an early presentation and people were like, "Oh, this is very interesting." And then this one teacher at the back, she raised her hand and she said, this is horrible. So she was looking at this first instantiation of OER Commons, and I thought, oh, does she not like the design or something? And so we said, well, why is this horrible? And she said, I already share anything I want whenever I want. I make photocopies. I just, if you're telling me now that all I can use are these things that have these open licenses that nobody knows about, I could never do my job. So we really began to understand kind of that Robin Hood aspect of what a teacher is doing day in and day out, right? They want to share and they want what's best for their students, period. So how do we marry these things together? But clearly, there had to be some kind of standards and agreement and some kind of mechanism to facilitate this collaboration and sharing of education content. These suite of licenses, had the best intentions. And in fact, in hindsight, Creative Commons was solving this really important problem of intellectual property for music and photographs. But I think dealing with what I'm going to call a public good, which is what I would say education is, that wasn't really inherent in the design of what they were doing. But at the same time, it provided a standard and a set of rules that we could use. By 2010, I think that ISKME alone had trained, well over 1,000 teachers about what Creative Commons was. But that's so that was a way, that's really what Creative Commons afforded us, the license, a way to legitimize and make it legally possible to collaborate and share. But then questions started coming. And in some ways, that's a little bit of a schism that started to be threatening the field. And in fact, those in the open source software said, get ready. This was the first time we really began to understand what the open source software folks referred to as these religious wars over licensing. And frankly, this was really about the use of commercial versus non-commercial use of licenses. And at the same time, so let me say, so the commercial versus non-commercial use. There were really claims by some of those in the community that a non-commercial use license was not really an open license. And at one point, they had even convinced one of the biggest funders of OER to mandate the use of that license as part of their grant giving requirements. That didn't really go over well. And at the same time, while this was happening, commercial publishers had really started to mount their attacks on OER, really threatening, saying it wasn't, the quality wasn't good. Why would you do this? And so there was sort of this talk in the field that we needed to show a united front. The publishers were saying, not only just the quality, but how it was available, and it was very disorganized. But thanks to some of the very early researchers in the fields, most of who probably were PhD students of Dave Wiley's, there was a concerted effort to show that the quality of OER was in fact equal or even better than what was produced commercially, and that it was just infinitely easier to adapt than a traditional textbook. So this is going on, the first really threat from commercial publishers. And something else was happening with the licenses. Several OER authors and content providers, they began to notice an interesting phenomenon, because of course, once the publishers were in there, they started to use the OER content commercially. And of course, your CC BY license would absolutely allow for that. So there was greater distribution of the content. Of course, who didn't want that? But they weren't receiving compensation, which is fine. That's the nature of the CC BY license. It's open, let it live, let it thrive, let it build its own business models. Who could argue with that, right? But who could actually make use of the content in that way and profit by it? It turned out that it was really largely dependent on if you had marketing budgets or distribution channels, if you had access to capital. Now, some of those in the OER field at the time really kind of poo-pooed this, and they were saying, well, educators just fantasize that they're going to make $1 million. That's the problem, But actually what those educators were saying was, on the ground who are actually doing this work, were saying, well, I'm paid by public school dollars or by my academic institution. why should what I do be used as R&D for commercial publishers? So that was one of the things that was coming up. Internationally, governments were reporting that they weren't willing to use the CC BY license because education was a state-supported effort. And so all those materials were theirs, and they couldn't legally let others make money from their government-funded public good. So there started to be these very interesting kind of fine, line sort of distinctions about this. At the same time, developing countries, global South, began to become very suspicious of these efforts of Western entities who were insisting that they should give away their content. The result was that, was OER being seen as kind of this Western concept, and would it have difficulty taking hold? It didn't help that for good reasons, I think Creative Commons as an organization wasn't really willing to kind of wrestle to the ground the legal aspects of what constituted non-commercial. There were things like, well, if you charge tuition, but the book was free, could they still use, a non-commercial license? So who has the right to make money from open? These are some of the conversations that started. Even today, there's, challenges we hear from indigenous communities, tribal communities. Who has the right to own their knowledge? Who has the right to use it? And in cultures where everything has been taken, appropriated, and resold, how can this be trusted? So I think it's important for these conversations to not be shut down, which I think, early on they were, because there was this sort of threat of commercial publishers. This is the time now to say, well, let's understand where, what the conversations were and how can we do it better? So this question is really still there, right? I mean, we absolutely need a structure to facilitate collaboration and sharing, right? If we can't, legally adapt it and redistribute it, we have to have some kind of rules of exchange. And I think we owe a debt of gratitude to Creative Commons. Without them in these licenses as a method of exchange, we never would have come as far as we have today. It really enabled the sharing, and it gave us a legal framework and for the rules of exchange. At the same time, we face these choice points moving forward. Is education just another kind of intellectual property like photos and creative works, which was really what the Creative Commons licenses had quite brilliantly addressed. Who do these licenses ultimately benefit, and how does the structure support the community? How inclusive is it? So those are some of the questions we have to ask, and we can't be afraid to disagree. I mean, if we can't ask questions, if we can't push those boundaries of our own learning, what are we doing? Yesterday in Angela DeBarge's keynote, I love that she quoted Bell Hooks about the need to be able to have a movement that enables transgressions, which are a movement against and beyond boundaries. It is that movement which makes education the practice of freedom. And I would argue the practice of OER. So let me go to the next choice point. So I'm going to give you 6 choice points. I'm going to give you a slide with all of them. So 6 maybe is too many, but I couldn't figure out how to reduce it. So the third point. So as those of you who've been around the field for a while, I think you can certainly appreciate the instrumental role that the Hewlett Foundation has played in this field. In the very early days of OER, the question of how we can, as a funder, support the creation and use of OER in the long term was quite relevant. In the choice point, I think at that time was, how could they encourage sustainable business models to create a really healthy ecosystem to support the means of production, right? At the same time, there was a bit of a premature, I would say a premature optimization. It was sort of imposed early on. And so while well-intentioned, how can we spur creation and adoption and use and improvement? It was a little bit sort of Silicon Valley style, and in some ways it's for some, of us. I think our concern was that, are we turning sort of this opportunity for a knowledge ecology to a knowledge economy before we've even really understood its impact? Many companies came and went. There were a lot of for-profits sort of entering the field. A lot of the nonprofits were trying to look at some of these public-private partnerships to try to figure out what they could do. Some of these things sort of imploded. There's no time to go into it here, but you can look up many different situations at the time. You look up Flat World Knowledge or UC Berkeley's lockdown of their 10,000 videos. There was a whole dilemma with the Pearson Foundation and Gates Foundation around who owned content, what kind of license, how could it be used. So there's lots of good stories there for a future talk. But just to say, it was a messy time, a time of a lot of innovation, right, which often happens in that mode. But the result was really a focus on business models before we were really understood what this meant to be transforming teaching and learning. Now, that part of the conversation was essentially dropped. So, you know, we had an increase in competition. There was a rush for funding, but the conversations about what did this mean, what could it be, was not really the conversation of the day. In some ways, I feel like the field was sort of forced too early to decide on business models. Those who were at the more prestigious or elite universities, they had secure funding. They didn't need to worry about business models, right? So missing now were those conversations as a field about how resources could be used to support local needs. What kind of community interfacing? What about the preservation of place in our resources, right? So there were many conversations that had to happen sort of under that, and with sort of this concern of, well, what does it mean for sustainability? Now, despite that, right, there were some great public-private partnerships, make no mistake about that. So much good did come out of this, right? OpenStax became viable. Lumen Learning was profitable. We at ISKME, we developed a library service model to support the ongoing feature developments and improvements in OER Commons. So a lot of good things happened. And again, there's many more examples. It's only really been, as I've seen in the last few years, that we have these, you know, robust institutes and discussions and conferences and experts on open pedagogy, you know, professional development certificates for libraries. You know, those are really recent. And of course, you know, the questions here again, not did we do, it wasn't what we did right or wrong. It's what kind of choice points did we have? What kind of decisions did we make? And how should we be, you know, looking at this now, right? Okay, so I want to go to the next point briefly, which is about interoperability. So interoperability, you know, the question we were trying to ask then is, how can we scale the search and discovery of OER? And we had several attempts at interoperability early on. You know, we were trying to look at economies of scale. We were trying to look at how we could improve efficiency and increase synergistic partnerships. That was really sort of the choice that was made. You know, how do we do this? Essentially, you know, between competition, disagreements of standards, right? Because if you have interoperability, you have to have conversations about standards. Anybody who's ever been involved in standards bodies knows that these things can take decades and still never actually sort themselves out. But it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, right? We had to have these conversations. I think this is where we really got libraries into the conversation. You know, what is the role of a library in thinking about interoperability and the discovery and search of OER? At the same time, some of you may have been at the California OER conference a couple of weeks ago, maybe that was just last week, sorry. Hal Plotkin gave a talk, but somebody was saying, why do I still have to go 7 places to find what I want, right? There's a lot of reinventing the wheel. So there's a reluctance, I think, to share across platforms. There's a kind of this thing about market share. I can say, we have really tried at OER Commons to continue to make attempts to ensure this happens. We're very excited about a development now. It's a prototype of an open metadata exchange, which is a far reach than just our work. But it's saying the premise sort of behind it is, how do we really share across libraries where we don't have to agree on standards, because we're never going to agree on standards. How do we crosswalk them? How do we transform them? Is there some role of that computational work can actually solve, where we don't have to do it with humans? So there's some exciting things happening. I mean, I think what has been shown over and over again is that one of the most important indicators of how educators want to find content, they want to know how it's been used before. They want to know if it aligns to their needs. So this is doable, although it's definitely going to require an investment from the field, both in terms of money as well as the will to really collaborate and share across libraries, across platforms, etc. So the next choice point I want to talk about is open textbooks. So, what the question we were asking at the time is, what can we do to bring more immediate recognition and awareness to the field, right? There was a lot of buzz, things going on. We had pockets here, pockets there. I think this was a really sort of path-defining moment in the field. I can remember being in a meeting with funders and high-level administrators, a small set of sort of nonprofits and researchers, and the topic was, how do we go to this next level? There's not enough awareness. We're kind of stagnant. How do we define once again what OER is and how it's presented to outside of the field, right? So there were a lot of heated debates about, back to the question, is this really about transforming teaching and learning, or could it instead be a model for creating a replacement for these outrageously expensive textbooks, right? So the choice point that was made on textbook was because it was a very well understood unit of instruction. I think everybody thought that this would be the door to open, and then once we opened that door, that's when we could actually get back to sort of this business of what the change was in terms of pedagogy and teaching and learning. Also, with this choice point being made, the whole textbook affordability campaign was born, and in many ways, this was really a turning point for the field. Some of you might remember Barbara Chow, who formerly led the education group at Hewlett after Mike Smith. During this time, or shortly thereafter, she brought another group together, and she basically stood up in front of the room and said, okay, she had come from DC before she came to Hewlett, very involved in policy. And she said, all right, I've created this meeting to bring the DC policy wonks, that's what she called them, and the OER nerds together. And they basically put us in a room for a day. And my recollection is that we were in like some room with no windows and we couldn't get out for the day. It was probably not that, but that's kind of how I remember it, that we spent an entire day really hashing out what were the beginnings of what we know as sort of these OER policy initiatives today. It created tremendous bonds and understanding between those who knew and really understood policy at the federal and state level, and for those of us who had been on the ground for several years, really working with educators on the whole search and discovery and the adoption of OER. So I don't think anyone would argue that the efforts around this have not been, enormous. Just look at the Spark policy playbook, right, to see the impact. Institutionally funded programs, statewide support, none of this existed prior to that. And maybe some of you today here, you haven't benefited from these kinds of success stories in your state or institution, but the seeds have been sown. It's just a matter of time before, we're going to see this really permeate through all aspects of education, whether it's from accreditation to teacher training, OER being used for tenure and promotion reviews. It's happening, it's here. So while this decision to focus on open textbooks, which led to this affordability movement, it has, provided just incalculable access, right? It's made the difference between students being able to afford an education or not. They didn't have to decide whether to purchase their textbooks or feed their family. So at the same time, what this really has produced is as a textbook is a replacement model, just kind of substituting an very expensive thing for a free thing. It kind of reminds me of, it's analogous to those beliefs that online education or distance education was going to revolutionize education. Well, actually, we just kind of replicated it, right? It was, of course, now we have pandemic education, sort of the same thing, but different. The same sort of one-to-many lectures, whether they're recording or online. I think that it's kind of foolhardy to imagine that by a simple replacement model that we can really bring about sort of this promise and potential of open education, yet it's made a phenomenal impact, and it's across states and policy conversations like never before. So the question about policy, as we sort of move from this need, I hope, of a recognizable unit of instruction, where else is change happening, or could it happen? Is it happening outside of the systems? Are policies enabling or disenabling the on-the-ground efforts? And how do we need to perhaps bring these both top-down and bottom-up things, efforts together? So last but not least, let me go to the final choice point, which was the choice about how do we increase the adoption of OER. And the answer at the time, the path forward was, well, let's increase the supply of OER and sort of displace the incumbent, right, the commercial publishers. And so this was about how we could just sort of, get out as much content as we could. I mean, millions of dollars have been spent on creating, high quality open textbooks. That this has been a phenomenal effort and worth its weight in gold. And as we know, many more millions of dollars have been saved by students who didn't have to make those hard choices about education and their lives. We got that right, right? The fact that we made some really good strategic decisions. So, initially a lot of those early grants were creating textbooks for lower division college courses, right? Which was an absolute boon to community colleges, huge impact there. At the same time, this top-down model, what it came with was a lack of representation, right? Of who in fact could create content, whose voice was heard, in sort of this, I might kind of call it a bit of a misguided benevolence, right? Who was it created for? And in this rush to create, we did miss the mark, for example, on accessibility. So, if supply was the answer, what was the question at that time, right? But what is the question now? How do we get it right? Some efforts that I think we've seen is about connecting to others in other fields. We're seeing this happen across disciplines. There's better tools for authoring, better systems for discovery, but this question of who gets to author and what kind of voices are there is, I think, a very important choice point today. Are we willing to say that cost savings is really the primary act of social justice for OER? I think we're not. So, what are those questions that we need to ask next? What are our choice points moving forward? So I think this issue about, who gets to ask the questions, what questions get shut down and why, whose questions get funded, whose questions get left out. These are really, I think, some of the key issues today. Oh, and when I say left out, that could be unintentionally, it could be intentionally. So again, there's not necessarily direct action here or intent. And what's really important, what I hope I've showed, is that we're not trying to blame a moment in time of history, but we can ask these questions now, of the past, as a way to make more transparent these choices about the future. I just wanted to show you briefly something that was created with myself and Eddie Watson and Doug Levin and input from many other folks, called the CARE framework. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because we were trying to really look at a lot of these issues and try to provide a model for what it meant to be good stewards of OER. And I'm not going to spend time talking about it really now, but there's one important thing I want to say is this was done over almost 3 years ago now, and that we are going to be updating it to a 2.0 version. We've gotten great feedback from the field. We know that there's missing pieces of it. It doesn't directly really address diversity and equity, even though Empower kind of covers that. The students aren't obviously center in this whole idea of the labor of open and who pays for that. These are some pieces moving forward. But I think the CARE framework was sort of our attempt to say, where haven't those questions been asked? Who is asking those questions now? And how do we support it together collectively with representation and inclusion? So just in summary, sort of these major choice points that I've talked about in OER history, it's been about, the choice points were about redistributing power in this ecosystem, incorporating structure to establish the rules of exchange, sustaining the field for the long term, designing for growth through efficiency and standards, increasing recognition and awareness outside of the field, and gaining credibility through supply and quality. I think some of the choice points we have today, and this is again, from my vantage point, I just sort of welcome what this will look like moving forward. Really sort of navigating that intersection with other disciplines, defining and really taking action on our commitment to broader topics such as accessibility, culturally responsive teaching, democracy, civic learning. And I think a choice point now, and many of you are involved here doing this today, it's really understanding and reflecting on our identity in the field in terms of inclusion and representation. Again, who is it that we want to be? And what are those choices we need to make to get there? Supporting nonlinear pathways and models of change, I think is something that we're seeing from a lot of research, that there's not one way in to OER and to OER scale, and what does that look like? And then making sure that the policies that we're creating, that they're actually removing obstacles. We don't want to be creating policies that make one thing be true, like when I talked about the replacement model of textbooks, like that's an important policy, but to have made, and it has an enormous impact on the field, but at what cost? And so if there's a cost, what are those policies that we can make to make sure that some of the transformation pieces around teaching and learning aren't sort of shut out of the equation? So in conclusion, and I've left a little time for questions here, I think that we know that, just that something is open is really not sufficient enough. We have to think about the diversity of authorship. That OER also serves as a bridge to other disciplines, I think is something that we should be, that has sort of happened organically. Like some of these bridges now between K-12 and higher education. I know in Michigan, there's a big effort, or a significant effort, to really be thinking about, okay, you've got this great higher, you've got a lot going on in community colleges, you have a lot going on with Go Open in K-12. How are these things starting to bridge that? And we're seeing that in many other states as well. Again, I want to leave you with this question of like, who do we want to be? What are the choice points? I have to say that in retrospect, after 20 years, I'm not worried about the same things. The OER landscape, it's more open and diverse in perspective than ever. The representation and voices that are here is absolutely in the right direction. So I would like to end there, and I guess I just want to say that I am just totally optimistic and energized by sort of this new generation of educators policymakers, advocates, the boots on the ground organizers. It gives me a huge boost of energy to see the work that is happening now, 20 years later. Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. Yeah, that was a lot to take. It's kind of like, wow, like historical and also very, yeah, like when we were talking, really provokes a lot of questions, for us audience, like, who do we want to be? And what are the choice points that we are going to make now and in the future? So before I read the questions from our participants, I just wanted you to comment on, like, so when you were talking about the choice points, I can't help but think about the role of philanthropic organizations, for funding all of these things that enabled us to make those choice points. And right now, it's not just the funders like ULIT, or other organizations that are doing that, but with the work that we have done within the community, the federal government, through the open textbook bill, right, is stepping in to fund some of the work that we do in the open, and in particular open textbooks. So I think that is a win, a major win for us to be able to do that as a field.
Absolutely. And if I had time, I certainly would have talked about that. I mean, just here in California, we've just received an appropriation of $115 million from our governor around open education and zero cost textbooks for community colleges in California. These are huge wins. This is unprecedented. So absolutely.
Yeah. And we have a question here from Dan McGuire. He asked, what is the primary barrier to widespread adoption of OER in the K-12?
So, I think in some ways I would want to put that question back to those of you who are in K-12 and say, where are you seeing those barriers? And I think, the question itself, I appreciate the question. Thank you, Dan. It's not that I don't think that there's really one answer. I think it is a combination of things. I think part of the barrier is around really having the bottom up approach, the grassroots effort, and they're more than grassroots now, but having those who are on the ground, the champions. A lot of that has happened separate from the policies that are happening at the higher level. And how do we, I made sort of the joke about the Barbara Chow bringing together the policy wonks and the OER nerds. I think in K-12, we really have to push those conversations between state leaders, district leaders, school leaders, teachers. Those are some of the most difficult conversations to have. And so far, even in some of the big movements like the Go Open movement in K-12, those things are still, they're kept apart. There's practitioners and then there's administrators. How do we bring those conversations together to think about how we're solving these problems, more systemically? I mean, we could go through many other of the challenges, that are happening. We could talk about the competition from commercial publishers. We could talk about inclusive access, which is more an issue on the higher ed side. I mean, there are many external factors, but I think what we could do specifically in these systems is really trying to integrate and create strategies around the bottom up and top down aspects of what's been happening in OER.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lisa. And Dave Goodrich asked, what are notable efforts, movements are there in the world of OER that are geared towards helping with universal design and or accessibility?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are some great efforts around that. The organization CAST has been doing a lot of work in the K-12 area. working with districts to begin to think about universal design and what that means and how to implement it and how do we think, there's sort of two ways to go now. You can sort of start at the very beginning while we're creating content in the first place, a much easier place to be thinking about universal design and accessibility, or how do we do it with this amazing legacy content that is out there, and what didn't we take into account that we have to now. Also, OCAD up in Canada is doing some terrific work internationally and also in the higher ed area. I don't know that we have time to really go into those specifically, but I would say that they're still a bit outside of of the realm of OER. I think when we move too fast, we kind of lose that aspect of what we really need to be designing for in the content. And I think this was kind of the supply comment, is when you're just cranking out supply, you're not actually starting to ask some of those harder questions.
Yeah. So are there any more questions? I don't see questions anymore, but I see, a lot of discussions in the chat. Lisa, can you briefly speak about, and I know you talk about that bridging, right? And Michigan is an example of that. That's why we have this Michigan OER network that, aims to bridge that many silos within the state, right? So we're a Go Open state. So we have our K-12 colleagues doing amazing work with OER. And then we have the Michigan colleges online for our community colleges, all 28 community colleges doing work with OER. And then, comes the 4-year universities, R1 institutions who are now really into OER. So even as a group, we are still, working towards like building that integration, that synergy, that partnership. And so as OER comments, right, like we have hubs actually, right, for Go Open and MCO. What can you tell us? And I know we're going to have that conversation, and I'm sure this is not just unique in Michigan.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad it's not just unique in Michigan, because I think what we're seeing is more and more of these systems that have been, so bifurcated in the past. Regina, I think I shared with you a story of a grant I had gotten as a faculty member to work with community colleges. And there was a big fight in my department at the time. Should this go to the higher ed group, or should this grant go to the K-12 group, right? There were these divisions, they had different rules, they had different processes. And so it's just very clear how many of these systems and states are not connected, right? That being said, I think OER is being used as a bridge in many of these ways to have these conversations. So community colleges, why I think OER in some ways has thrived much more so in the community colleges in these cases, is that there's been such a high demand in the issues around affordability, issues around teaching being a primary aspect of a community college. Those issues are just much more central to some of the issues that OER is really addressing. At the same time, I think as you start to kind of go back into K-12 and then go back up to higher ed, we're seeing things like around dual enrollment or middle college. And we're starting to say like, well, okay, what are those courses that are already offered at the K-12 side? And are those similar to community college? Do we have all of our resources and materials for those two things? Likewise, if we have great content that's for lower division courses, how could those now be used in 4 years? And then what are the more specialty areas in the 4-year colleges? So, because then we have a lot more, upper divisions, smaller classes, not the big textbooks, not the textbooks that are used by, thousands and thousands of students. So, it sounds kind of old fashioned to say that we just have to do the hard work of beginning to connect and cross those bridges together. I'm again thinking of Angela's talk yesterday and how she had many great pictures of different kinds of bridges and how scary those bridges are, and are they built of the right materials? And What's the risk when you go across the bridge? And when you cross the bridge, is somebody going to support you there? I think those are the same kinds of questions that we'll be asking now as OER gives such a common conversation. I mean, I think that's what OER is really bringing to the field. And that's why I'm very optimistic that Michigan is going to be a shining example of that happening. Because you've been using OER as a means of change and transformation. And so now actually doing that across is where you're going to have your greatest success.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Thank you for that wonderful talk. I wish we had more time. Really, I hope you stay, during the day. And if you have any questions about Lisa's presentation or about anything, please just email her. Her contact information is available, and her presentation will be uploaded very soon. So we will pause for, I think, about 14 minutes, and we will start with our first concurrent session for the day. It will be at 12:15. So please look at your schedule to see the amazing sessions that we have. And then we will have another lunch and network opportunity for you to meet other folks who are working in the open, not just in Michigan, but in other states as well. And then we are going to have our second concurrent session for the day. And please don't forget to attend our wrap-up and raffle drawing. So we will have some raffle drawing that we are going to give to folks who will be in the room. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Lisa. And we will see you throughout the day. Bye, everyone.